morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to finally be able to say that to you all. Good morning, Dr. Proctor.
Good morning.
Before we get started, do you need any water?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, great. Dr. Proctor, we've met before,
Yes.
as you discussed with Mr. Gerson. So as you know, we're going to spend some time today talking about some of the things that you discussed with Mr. Gerson on direct, okay?
Sure.
And Dr. Proctor, you know that you're here in Mrs. Barbara Morales' case, right?
Yes.
And you understand, because you've done this many times before, that the question for this jury has to do with Mrs. Morales, right?
Well, yes.
And so I want to explore with you some things to help the jury have a little bit more context about how your testimony relates to Mrs. Morales and the issues in this case, okay?
Okay.
Now, you spent a lot of time over the past couple of days talking about the tobacco companies. And you only spent a little bit of time yesterday at the very end talking about Mrs. Morales, right?
That's right.
But you do know some things about Mrs. Morales, right?
Not much, but a few things.
All right, well, I'm going to start off with an easy one for you this morning. Dr. Proctor, where was Mrs. Morales born?
Well, she was born in Cuba,
And
in
Dr.
a small village south of Havana.
Got that one right. Where also, or let me back up. When did Mrs. Morales come to the United States?
In 1980, I believe.
And Dr. Proctor, you knew those things before Mr. Gerson yesterday asked you to assume them, right?
I think so, yeah. I was told that at my deposition.
Well, actually, before your deposition, you had a conversation with Mr. Gerson about Mrs. Morales.
That's right.
And during that conversation, Mr. Gerson did tell you a few things about Mrs. Morales, right?
A few, yes.
Well, one of those things that he told you was that Mrs. Morales does not read or speak English.
Correct. I recall that.
And according to Mr. Gerson, he told you that Mrs. Morales began smoking Cuban cigarettes in the early 1960s in Cuba.
Something like that.
And that while she lived in Cuba, she continued smoking Cuban cigarettes, right?
I think I recall that, yes.
And he also told you that she did not shift to American cigarettes until she came to the U.S. in 1980.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Proctor, you spent a lot of time over the last couple of days discussing statements made by tobacco company employees, right?
Yes.
You talked about statements made by company employees from R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, Lorillard, Brown & Williamson. I think I may have forgotten a few, but...
That's right. Lorillard.
And another easy question for you, Dr. Proctor. Who makes Winston cigarettes?
Well, that's the R.J. Reynolds company.
Who makes Marlboro cigarettes?
That's Philip Morris.
Now, you talked about statements made by these employees in press releases, on TV, and in newspapers, right?
Yes.
You also spent some time talking about statements made by representatives of tobacco company organizations like TI, CTR, TIRC, right?
That's right.
Similarly, you talked about statements those people made in press releases and on TV and in newspapers, right?
That's right.
And the evidence that you presented about all of those statements were that those statements were made in the United States, right?
Yes.
You talked about statements from the 1950s, right?
Yes.
And one of those statements was the Frank statement from 1953.
54, actually.
54, yes, thank you. January of 1954, right?
Yes.
And you said that the Frank statement was published in a lot of newspapers across the country, right?
That's right.
And when you spoke to plaintiff's counsel about this case, did he tell you that Mrs. Morales never heard of anything called the Frank statement?
I don't recall one way or the other.
Well, if Mrs. Morales was born in 1947, then she would have been 6 years old and living in Cuba at the time that the Frank statement was published in the United States, right?
That sounds about right.
And you have no evidence that the Frank statement was published in Cuba.
I don't. I haven't looked one way or the other.
But you doubt it was, right?
I doubt it was.
So let's fast forward then. You also talked about some statements from the 1960s and 1970s in the United States where tobacco companies were disputing the dangers of smoking.
Right.
And as we've been discussing, Mrs. Morales was living in Cuba during that time.
Yes.
During your conversation with plaintiff's counsel about Mrs. Morales, were you told that Mrs. Morales did not see, hear, or read any U.S. tobacco company statements when she lived in Cuba?
I wasn't.
But you're not aware of any evidence that during the 1960s or 70s, any U.S. statements, tobacco company statements, were broadcast in Cuba, right?
I'm not aware of that. I haven't